we began studying an interesting question in the laws of Kiddush in the Taz. The Taz is in Simon Reish Ayin Aleph, and if you have the pages that David Spiegel was kind enough to circulate, it's actually on page Chaf Dalit, going on to page Chaf Hey. It's a long piece in the Taz. The Taz, as you know, lived about 4.5 centuries ago, and he had a case, an actual case, where he had 2 cups of liquids in front of him at the time of Kiddush. One was Mayim, the other was Yayin. And when he recited Kiddush, accidentally, he picked up the Mayim, not being aware of the fact that he had taken the wrong cup. And the question was, he finished the entire Kiddush over a cup of water, and did he have to recite Kiddush a second time? And the Taz has what I call the Havamina, and then the Maskana. So in the Havamina, he thinks for sure that he doesn't have to recite Kiddush a second time, even though he accidentally recited Kiddush over Mayim instead of Yayin. And he argues with a very fascinating, sophisticated piece of lumdus, of conceptual thinking. He says that on a level of Kiddush Doraisa, he has fulfilled his mitzvah of Kiddush even without Yayin. The requirement of Yayin is only the Rabbanon. And therefore, the Rabbanon, when they established the mitzvah of Yayin for Kiddush, it was meant to be an embellishment of the mitzvah of Kiddush Doraisa. In other words, the Torah only required Kiddush per se, without a cup of wine. The Rabbanan said, make that Kiddush and fulfill that mitzvah over a cup of wine. But in event that you've already fulfilled the mitzvah Doraisa, i.e. without a cup of wine, the Rabbanan are not going to tell you to make a second Kiddush just for the sake of the Drabanan of Yayin, because the Drabanan of Yayin was only established to enhance the mitzvah Doraisa of Kiddush al Yayin. If you've already fulfilled the mitzvah Doraisa of Kiddush al Yayin, then there's no point to making a second Kiddush over Yayin. And offhand, there's a very compelling logic to this. He even brings a proof from a halacha called Nishpach. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that if before you drink the kos, it spills, you do not recite Kiddush a second time. You take another cup of yayin, make a bar priya gofen, and that's it. So you see that even though the Kiddush was recited without yayin, because there was nishpach, it spilled, nevertheless you don't repeat Kiddush. So we got stuck on this Taz with the following question. We've already established, if you recall, that if Kiddush Doraisa does not require Yayin, then you fulfilled your mitzvah of Kiddush Doraisa in Tefillah, because the elements of Kiddush are right there in the formula, in the recitation of Tefillas Arvis, which ends with Mekadesh HaShavos. Well, if that be the case, then why do we recite Kiddush a second time when we come home over a cup of wine? According to the logic of the Taz, the rabbinic, the Rabbanan Takana of Yayin was only meant to be incorporated into Kiddush Doraisa. But if you've already fulfilled Kiddush Doraisa, and now we have 3 cases. Case number 1, he fulfilled Kiddush Doraisa over a cup of water. Case number 2, he fulfilled Kiddush Doraisa and then the yayin spilled before he got to drink it. In case number 3, he fulfilled Kiddush Doraisa in Tfilas Arvis. Why then does he recite a second Kiddush? So the Taz, on the one hand, has a very strong proof from the halach of Nishpach that there's no Kiddush D'Rabbanan as a separate entity if he's already fulfilled and achieved his mitzvah Doraisa of Kiddush, and applying that very meticulously with an excellent analogy to the case in which he made Kiddush al Mayim. But what's he going to do with Kiddush Doraisa in Tefillah? And apparently, between the lines of the Taz, we have to come to the conclusion that the Taz is of the opinion that he did not fulfill his mitzvah of Kiddush with Ma'ariv, with the davening in the Beis HaKnesses. And the explanation would make sense if you hold mitzvahs trifos kavana. His kavana was for the mitzvah of tefillah and not for the mitzvah of Kiddush. Could he have, and would it be that he had kavana for the mitzvah of Kiddush while he was davening in shul? Then according to the logic of the Taz, he would not recite a second Kiddush when he comes home. Alternatively, perhaps the Taz would make a distinction between the halacha of Kiddush al Yayin and Kiddush b'makom suda. The Taz might logically argue that with regard to Kiddush b'makom suda, that might be a doraisa halacha. And the Rabbanan are saying that when you come home from shul, you must recite another Kiddush because the original Kiddush was not b'makom suda. Whether it be a Kiddush al Yayin or al Amayim, according to the Taz's logic, might not make any difference. But a Kiddush you'd have to recite in a Makom Suda. And this was the Taz's Havamina. He goes on a tirade against the Mari. The Mari he quotes here, and again we're on page Chavdalid in the Taz, writes that in a case where he accidentally made Kiddush on Mayim instead of Yayin, there's no question in the Mari's mind that he has to repeat Kiddush al Yayin. And he gives an example of Tkiyah Shofar. Now we know that the Tkiyos of Shofar are divided into two. The Tkiyos Doraisa are fulfilled before Musaf, and that's called Tkiyos Demiyusha. The Rabbanan required a second round, a series of Tkiyos, which is called Tkiyos de Me'umad, al Seder Tefillah in the Musaf service, whether it be in the Tefillas Lachash, Tefillas Hashatz, whatever it might be. We're not going into those details. And the Mari says that if in the second series of Tkiyos, namely the Tkiyos de Me'umad, which are only D'Rabbanan, he would make a mistake and he messed up on a Tkiyah, on a Shvarim, on a Trua, what it might be, he would have to repeat the Tkiyos. Now, he's already fulfilled his mitzvah doraisa with Tkiyos Demiyusha before the Musaf service. And yet, for the sake of the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, in the second series of Tkiyos Dema'umad al Seder Tefillah, if he makes a mistake, he'll repeat it. So you see that even in a case where on a doraisa level you fulfilled your obligation, the Rabbanan will require you another set of Tkiyos Ma'aseh Mitzvah in order to get it straight on a Rabbanan level. The Rabbanan are not coming to enhance a doraisa, but rather to add a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And that mitzvah d'Rabbanan obligates you as a separate independent entity, despite the fact that you've already checked off and achieved your kiyum, your mitzvah d'oraisa, you've fulfilled your duty of Yom Trua Yelachem through the Tkiyos, the Miyusha before the Shmon Esrei, and nevertheless the Rabbanan are requiring a separate kiyum d'Rabbanan of Tkiyos al Seder HaTfilah, the Tkiyos de Me'umad. And for that they will require you to repeat the Tkiyos again. And the Taz doesn't understand what the Mari is batting about. There's no equation here between the case of Kiddush al Amayim, where he mistakenly made Kiddush on water, and the case of someone who messed up on the Tkiyos de Me'umad. In the case of Tkiyos de Me'umad, the Rabbanan want a different kind of Tkiyah. They don't want a Tkiyah that's outside the framework of tefillah. They want a tkiyah that's integrated into the very fabric of tefillah. And they established those tkiyos. And therefore, if he made a mistake during those tkiyos, he hasn't fulfilled that mitzvah d'Rabbanan of tkiyos that are integrated into the tefillah. and therefore, if he made a mistake, he'll have to repeat those tkiyos. But in the case of Kiddush, argues the Taz, it's a whole different story. The Rabbanan are not creating a new mitzvah of Kiddush in addition to the Kiddush D'Oraisa. They're only enhancing the Kiddush D'Oraisa by requiring a kos of yayin. Furthermore, argues the Taz against the Mari, in the Mari's case, is no loss whatsoever. It's a win-win situation. Why? Because by repeating the Tkiyos to Me'umad, he's not going to make a separate bracha. It's just a matter of blowing the shofar. But here, in the case of Kiddush, if you're going to argue that in order to fulfill Kiddush al Yayin, he needs a new Kiddush, then he's making a separate bracha on Kiddush al Yayin. And that, according to the Taz, is a bracha levatol. Ad kan, until this point, the Taz feels very secure. But yet, all this is the havamin of the Taz. And after this beautiful thesis, for which we would perhaps give him a PhD, he changes his mind. This is what you call the intellectual honesty of the Gedolei Torah. And here we move on to the second half of the Taz, which you might find on page Chaf Hey. And he says, Omnam Acher Ha'iyun, and this is on line 5, Iyanti, I looked at it a second time. It's much more complicated than I made it out to be. And he says the following. If a man made Kiddush with the intention of eating in place X, location X, and then, as it turns out, he could not eat in location X, and he's got to reestablish himself in location Y. Even though he was Yotzei his mitzvah d'oraisa, so argues the Taz, in location X, where he made Kiddush, the halacha requires him, and this is mefurish in the Shulchan Aruch, to recite another Kiddush in location Y. So again, follow the logic here. He was Yotzei his mitzvah d'oraisa, according to the Taz. Again, one could argue against the Taz. But the premise of the Taz is that in location X, his first location, where he had originally intended to eat his meal, he recited Kiddush. He has fulfilled his mitzvah d'oraisa of Kiddush. Albeit shalom b'makom suda, but that's d'oraisa. The Rabbanan require Kiddush makom suda. Now he relocates himself to location Y. He's going to be required to recite a second Kiddush. Why, asks the Taz? As far as the mitzvah d'oraisa is concerned, he already achieved the mitzvah d'oraisa in location X, in his first location. Elamai, we have to assume that the Rabbanan created a new entity of Kiddush, which is Kiddush b'makom suda, and it stands on its own as an independent machayev, even in event that he's already fulfilled his mitzvah d'oraisa of Kiddush. And therefore, the Taz comes to the conclusion that even for the sake of the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, he'll have to recite a second Kiddush. And the Taz assumes an analogy, an equation between Makom Suda and Kiddush al Yayin. And if in Makom Suda, despite the fact that he has fulfilled his mitzvah d'oraisa, he needs a second Kiddush b'Makom Suda, he's got now two Kiddushes and two brachos, then the same logic should apply in the case of Mayim instead of Yayin, that since he did not fulfill his mitzvah d'Rabbanan of Kiddush al Yayin, he will have to recite a new Kiddush. However, the Taz makes the following distinction and draws the following conclusion. I'll read it inside. Again, if you happen to have the Taz that David put up on the site, you'll see 5 lines before the end. V'nira lita ikar toli b'kiddush shetzarich litom yayin b'shas kiddush. He says the following, that the Rabbanan are requiring that b'shas kiddush he drink yayin. And again, we're going to have to study this in great in depth, but just on a superficial level, the Taz is now postulating that there are two parts and sort of like independent parts to the mitzvah of Kiddush. The first part of Kiddush is the recitation, the Amira, the bracha itself. The second part is the Te'ima, is the Shtiyas HaYayin. And the Shtiyas HaYayin, although it has to be connected and linked up with the recitation, you can't just recite Kiddush and then 10 minutes later, take out a bottle of wine from the fridge and pour a cup of wine. But that mitzvah of Shtiyas HaYayin as almost an auxiliary or tag-on to the mitzvah of Kiddush remains an independent obligation, independent of Kiddush itself. Again, it has to be connected to Kiddush, and in the language of the Taz, it must be, as he calls it, b'shas Kiddush. So the time element here, or shall we call it the synchronization of Kiddush and Shtia, will integrate his Shtia into the Kiddush. So it becomes a Shtia of Kiddush, but nevertheless it stands on its own. Therefore, says the Taz, in my case, where I made Kiddush al hamayim, but I had in front of me a kos shel yayin, I could immediately switch channels the very split second that I realize, hey, what I have in my cup here is mayim, put down the mayim, pick up the other kos, and drink the other kos. Such that now the Shtiyas HaYayin becomes b'shas Kiddush. But Einachinami, if he would have to go, again, he doesn't say these words, I'm trying to fill in the blanks here, but if he would have to go to his closet or to his fridge and take out wine and then pour in a cup of wine, then the Shtia would be independent and cut off from the Kiddush. And in the language of the Taz, he says the following. Amru Zachar es Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho Zachreu al Yayin. What does it mean, Zachreu al Yayin? Shetzarch sheyehei sham. Sham means right there in front of him at the moment of Kiddush, Yayin v'teimas Yayin. He's going to drink the wine that's right there in front of him. The Yomer Kiddush Olav. There should be some connection between the Kiddush and the Shtia. So there's Zachreu, which is the recitation of Kiddush, and then there's Al Yayin, which requires the Shtia of the Yayin of Kiddush. Two separate obligations. One obligation in the recitation of Kiddush, we call the Maisa Amira, the Maisa Bracha, and another mitzvah of Al Hayayin. Well, which Yayin? It's got to be the Yayin of Kiddush. And how does he achieve Yayin of Kiddush? And he says the following. Zeh she'ira lo kilkul l'teimas Yayin. The person who had in his hand a cup of water, Kiddush olav Kiddin. The Kiddush itself was Kiddin, because as we said, the recitation of Kiddush is one mitzvah unto itself. El sheyef shelo liton. But now he can't fulfill his second obligation of te'ima of Zachreu al hayayin. V'lo yuchal l'taken ha'ivus sheyitom yayin acher. Acher means that's not in front of him at the time of Kiddush. Masha ein ken b'din makom suda shev'ira shelo yuchal lechol sham ein takana le'ivus zeh al kein tzorach l'kadish shenis b'makom sheyochal. V'im kein b'nidan didan, in our case where he had 2 cups of liquids in front of him, shalo kidesh karoi, because he took in his hands the kos of mayim. So he says he would require kiddush al yain shenis, but he says yesh l'chilik b'dover de'im haya hayayin b'shas kiddush. He had the yayin there b'shas kiddush ala shulchan, on the table, or ala safsel, or on the, they used to eat from a little stender, and then They would bring out the food on a sapsel on a tray. Etzlo, and it's right there. Muchan. It was ready and prepared for shtia from the time that he made Kiddush. As vadai ein sarach. He doesn't need lo birkas spor priagafen, v'lo kiddushenis, el yishte hamuchan lefana. So according to the Taz's conclusion, everything depends upon what's muchan lefanav or not muchan lefanav. So just to summarize, the bottom line, the conclusion of the Taz is that if you recited Kiddush and there was yayin muchan lefanav, then that's fine. So, for example, remember the case that we discussed of Nishpach. The wine that he made Kiddush on spilled, but he has more wine. The bottle of the wine is there on the table or on the safsal. So that's Muchan Lefanav. He didn't intend to make Kiddush on the wine in the Bak book in the container, but it was Muchan. But if, on the other hand, he doesn't have Yayin Muchan, and it was Nishpach, now he's going to need a second Kiddush in order to establish a shtia of Yayin of Kiddush. Because the Yayin that he takes out of his closet, that wine is not Yayin of Kiddush. And that shtia is not a shtia of Yayin shel Kiddush. And so too, if he recited Kiddush lo b'makom suda, then the makom suda is not Muchan. And therefore, he's going to need another Kiddush in makom suda. However, in the case of the Taz, where the second cup of wine was Muchan, ala shulchan, and he needs a shtia, then he could achieve his mitzvah, his obligation of shtia, with that kos of yain that was Muchan, that was there from the get-go, ready for him to make Kiddush al yain. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know what the minig is in your home, whether or not you pour the Kiddush wine before the Kiddush for the sake of those who are at the table, the Mesubim. There are different minhagim. Some people are makpid that no one has wine except for the Kiddush cup, and only after the Kiddush do you pour and distribute the yain. Others have a minhag that already beforehand, this one likes grape juice, and this one likes white wine, and this one red wine. Everybody pour your cup. I've even seen people who stand there with their cup holding up. It's holding up. And I was thinking that although, honest to goodness, I was a little cynical about this minhag, that everybody gets their own cup and all this. I mean, there's one cup of Kiddush. But perhaps you could say, according to the Taz's final conclusion, that since each cup of wine for Reuven, Shimon, Levi, for Yehudis and Sima and Sarah and Leah, each cup of wine was there ala shulchan at the time that Reuven recited Kiddush, maybe, and it's a little bit far-fetched, but maybe with a little stretch, we could say that the Kiddush is chal on all the cups of wine because they're all min hamuchan. Just like in the Taz's case, where he had mayim, yayin, and the Taz says that he could be yotze even though he took the mayim in his hand at the time of the Kiddush, because even the yayin in the second cup, since it's muchan al shulchan, it can serve as yayin shel Kiddush if you drink it immediately after the Kiddush. Okay, and now we move on to the Minchas Chinuch. Yeah, questions, Bobby?
What about the Makom Suda part of it?
So again, the Taz's argument is that if you make Kiddush lo b'makom suda, then as far as that separate din that you have to drink the cup of wine b'makom suda, you forfeited that. That's what he calls a kilkul, a ma'uva she'eno yochel saken, so that he's not going to have a shtia of yain b'makom suda. So when he relocates himself to place B, he needs a new Kiddush because there's no yayin.
So that means that if I made Kiddush and then somehow I didn't have the Suda there, I thought it was there, but it's not there, I have to make Kiddush again.
That's the Taz. And the Taz says that nobody argues about that. That's Kuliyama lo pligis a davar pashut.
Right. So, and that's that. The Makom Suda is part of the Rabbanan Dika.
Right. The Rabbanan of Shtia, because Rabbanan set up a second chiyuv, which is not Doraisa, that Zachreu means alayayin. On a Doraisa level, Zachreu means divrei zchira and
Are you
kiddush.
saying Zakreo al Hayayin vi al Suda?
Yayin and Suda become one and the same. The Yayin has to be the Yayin b'makom Suda. Why?
Really,
Let's take a minute to explain that. What's the relation between Yayin and the drinking of the wine and makom Suda? The answer is the following. Yayin itself has a very special status in the laws of brachos, in the world of Hilchos Suda. Yayin, no less than lechem, than pas, is a vehicle for setting up a Suda. Again, it requires a certain minimum amount of yayin, but if you have that minimum amount of yayin, we'll call it mole lugmav or rov revius, the shtia of that yayin sets off a seudah. Yain itself, unlike any other food other than pas, is a koveh of suda. Kiddush on a Darabanan level requires Kiddush with suda. You begin, that's why, for example, you're not allowed to eat before Kiddush. Why is that so? I mean, you really shouldn't be eating before any mitzvah, but if you eat before a mitzvah, that's not catastrophic. But you're not allowed to eat before Kiddush because the mitzvah of Kiddush is a Kiddush that sets up the Suda. The Suda on Shabbos, it's not like a Suda on Chol. Suda on Chol, I'm in the mood for a Suda, I want to eat a meal, I eat a meal. It doesn't require any preliminary introductions. But in the case of Shabbos, there's a new entity called Suda Shabbos. And by what means, or shall we call it, by what mechanical agent do I set up a Suda Shabbos? What do? I take a placard and I write on it, obviously before Shabbos, Suda Shabbos? No. I have to be Kovea Suda Shabbos through Kiddush. And there are two options. I could be Kovea Suda Shabbos through Kiddush al Pas. I could be Kovea Suda Shabbos through Kiddush al Yayin. But in either event, I am now setting up a Kiddush on the Suda, such that the purpose of Kiddush is to set up and effectuate a Kiddush, a Suda Shabbos. Not by announcing, Rabbosai, we're now going to eat a Suda Shabbos. That's not enough. That's not effective. But through Kiddush, which now culminates with Yayin or with Pas, I have linked up the Kiddush to the Suda because the Yayin is Koveh Suda, the Pas is Koveh Suda, and by linking up the Kiddush to the Suda, I transform the Suda into a Suda Shabbos.
So according to that,
yeah,
if you're saying you can be Koveh Suda on Yayin, so I don't need food at that point. Once I drink my Moli Lugma wine, I'm Yaitza my Suda because I've Koveh Suda on the wine.
Again, we're getting into a lot of details that have to be ironed out. I mean, what is a Suda Shabbos? We're going to have a whole kuntres on the subject of Suda Shabbos. But in the meantime, certainly during the day, by the way, again, there's another kuntres called Kiddush Bayom. But I'm just saying, if I want to take a shortcut, I would tell you that in Kiddush Yom, if you drank wine to the tune of Mole Lugmav, and you were Koveh Suda, you would not have to wash even. You could be Yotzi a second of 3 Sudos, Al Yayin. And by the way, the Rambam requires that all 3 Sudos require Yayin. And the Rambam has a quasi Kiddush for Shalosh Shudas, for the Sudah Shlishit, as we call it.
Right. So there's a bit of a misnomer when people, if you during the day, for example, you're in a Kiddush, like let's say in the shul, if you drink your wine, Moli Lugmav, you don't necessarily have to eat something.
Okay, again, according to this school of thought, you're right. You were Koveh Sudal Yayin, you were Yotze Kiddush, and you don't have to wash.
Right.
It'll be a big nafkamina during the winter. What time is Shkia in your part of the world? Now 4 or 5? What time? This
yeah. 4:30.
Who has room in their bellies for Sudash Lishit? But if you're going to say that he was Makadesh al Yayin, let's say in Shul there was a Kiddush al Yayin, it was B'makom Suda because the Yayin itself is Koveh Suda, then maybe you could count that as your second Suda. Again, I'm not getting into the details here. This is all very theoretical. We're only at the beginning of our trip. But if one would say that through Yayin he was Kovea and Yotze Sudas Shabbos in Shul, that his Sudash Lishit is at home when he eats lunch. I mean, that could save him a lot. Okay. The Minchas Chinuch is bothered by a gewaltige kasha. And honestly, I have no clue how to answer this question. And this is on page Chaf Zayin, if you're following the pages. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Psachim, Daf Kuf Yud Zayin, in the name of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, that Kiddush requires Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. And it's based on Gzeras Shavah. Because on the one hand, the Torah says, Leman Tizkar Es Yom Tzeischa Mitzrayim. So let's emphasize the word Tizkar. Uksiv Hasam, and elsewhere in Parshas Yisro, it says Zachar Yom Shabbos Lekacho. Again, the word Zachar. Just like Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim is written with the word Zachar, so too Kiddush, by virtue of the fact that it's written in the formula of Zachar, requires Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. So far, so good. If you open up your siddur for Kiddush of Friday night, you'll see in the Nusach HaKiddush, Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim. Frek the Minchas Chinuch, I don't understand, we have a whole slew of Achronim, starting from the Magen Avraham and all the way down. And they all hold that you could be Yotzei Kiddush Doraisa. In Tefillah, in Ma'ariv, guess what? How many times do we mention Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim in Ma'ariv? Zippo. Open up your siddur, check me out, and you will see that there's no mention of Yitzias Mitzrayim in Tefillah. So you might argue that maybe the Gemara of Rav Acha in Psachim is referring to a rabbinic institution on a Doraisa level. The Achronim are all right, starting from the Magen Avraham and down, that you Yotzei Doraisa without mentioning Yitzias Mitzrayim in Tefillah. Says the Minchas Chinuch, that's impossible. Because whatever we derive from Gzeras Shavah is Doraisa. It's not Darabanan. There's no such thing as deriving a Darabanan from Gzeras Shavah. Gzeras Shavah is Doraisa. It's one of the Yud Gimel Midas Shator Nidreshes by him. So how could it have crossed the minds of so many Gedolei Achronim that you could be Yotzei Kiddush Doraisa in Tefillah when there's no mention of Yitzias Mitzrayim in Tefillah? Gewaldige kasha the Minchas Chinuch. I have no clue how to maneuver to try to answer this kasha the Minchas Chinuch. However, let's just mention that the Taz that we spent so much time on says that he was Yotzei his mitzvah doraisa of Kiddush ala Mayim, but he recited Kiddush. The Taz doesn't mention that he was Yotzei his mitzvah doraisa of Kiddush in Tefillah. Now, we suggested that the reason why the Taz omitted that step is because mitzvah strichas kavana, and his kavana was for Tefillah and not for Kiddush. But according to the Minchas Chinuch, we have a much better reason to explain why the Taz, when he was arguing that you were Yotzei your mitzvah doraisa, he failed to mention Tefillah. And the answer is because there's no Yitzias Mitzrayim in Tefillah. That's not going to help us for all the other Achronim, especially the Magen Avraham at the head of the pack, who say that you were Yotzei your mitzvah doraisa of Kiddush in Tefillah. Where's the Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim? You may recall, I think it was about maybe 2-3 weeks ago, we discussed the Chassam Sofer, whether it's a good idea to be Yotzei Kiddush Doraisa in Tefillah. And you may recall that he advocated that it's not a good idea. You should not have kavana and a fakert. You should have a negative kavana in Tefillah not to be Yotzei. And he has a whole cheshbon. If you recall, you want to be yotzei tefillah doraisa, b'makom suda, al hayayin. Don't play games with tefillah. And with that, he answers up the whole kasha, the Noda Yehuda, how a husband can make kiddush for his wife. After all, he was yotzei of doraisa. She has not yet davened. She did not fulfill a mitzvah doraisa. He's only chayv d'rabbanan, etc., etc. He says the answer is he's going to have kavana not to be yotzei his mitzvah doraisa of kiddush in tefillah. According to Minchas Chinuch, he could not even possibly be yotzei his mitzvah doraisa in tefillah. Why? Because there's no zeichel tzis mitzrayim. And I would say on the contrary, again, this is Berzon talking. If let's say he has no wine, he has no pas, he has no possibility of fulfilling his mitzvah of kiddush the way the Rabbanan formulated it, the best he can do is to fulfill kiddush d'oraisa, and that he's going to do in tefillah. Comes along Berzon and he says, if that be the case, he should add 3 words to his tefillah. Add the words Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim. Now you might ask me, well, that's a chutzpah noira. Berzon is creating new nuschos in tefillah. Put him into cherem. Who gives you the audacity to add 3 words to tefillah? So I just want to say the following. My Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, once told us that if there's an overlap between Yontif and Shabbos, and we get up to Yala v'Yavo in the tefillah of Regel, Sholshos Regalim, he said you should add Shabbos into the Yala v'Yavo. Not just Yom Rosh Chodesh hazeh or Yom Chag HaMatzos hazeh, but it's Yom HaShabbos hazeh. Ves Yom Chag HaMatzos hazeh. And when I heard this, again, I was a young fellow, so I didn't have the chutzpah to say to the Rav, Rebbe, how could you add something to the Nusach Tefillah? It's printed in the Sidurim. It doesn't mention Shabbos in Yalav Yom. You will find absolutely no siddur, even in the Pinsker building, that has a mention of Shabbos in Yalav Yom. Again, the logic of Rav Soloveitchik is very compelling in and of itself. In all of the tefillos of the Sholosh Regalim, we always mention Shabbos if there's a coincidence of Shabbos and Yontif. Why shouldn't we do that in Yalav Yom? Why do we insult the Shabbos by omitting Shabbos? Today is Shabbos. Okay, anyway, I just got off a little bit on a tangent. What we're up to now is page Chav Zayin.
By the way, so the Minchas Chinuch's question, would anybody suggest that the fact that we've just been, we did Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim in the Birchas Kriya Shema, that can help you for tefillah, I guess. In other words,
that can help you for the mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim for sure, but it's not going to help you for Kiddush, because Kiddush requires a bracha. You remember our diuk in the Rambam that we started with, that Kiddush requires the framework of a bracha. So you have to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim in the bracha. The fact that in Kriyat Shema you were Yotzei Yitzias Mitzrayim, that's not going to help you. I suspect that if there is an answer to defend the Magen Avram against the Hasaga, the Hagah of the Minchas Chinuch, it has something to do with Gzeira Shava. Again, I need to research this, but I think that there may be 2 different categories of a Gzeira Shava. And if I had the time, again, I don't have my library here in Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is a problem in and of itself, but I have a copy of the Encyclopedia Talmudit. Take a look under Gzeira Shava. And I'm sure that you'll see that the definition of Gzeira Shava is full of nuances. A lot of what you see in Chazal, I mean, you gentlemen do the Daf Yomi. What percentage of Daf Yomi is Droshos and Yelfusis? I know in my mind it's like 90%. Okay, I'm just exaggerating. But I remember when I was teaching Daf Yomi and Kiddushin, like there were like pages and pages of Yalfusas, and you have to hold cup because this Tana didn't dash in this pasuk. This even in Bava Kama today, Yalfusas like upon Yalfusas. And very often the Xeris Shava is a little bit loose. Do you follow me by loose? It's like it's not tight. Often it's kicha mistayefron. It's the same word, but sometimes it's a bit of a stretch. And I'm suspecting that there might be such a thing as an asmachta d'Rabbanan, which is Xeris Shava, meaning it looks like Xeris Shava, it smells like Xeris Shava, but it's not really a real McCoy Xeris Shava. That's what I think is the general area if somebody would want to come along and defend the Magen Avram against the Minchas Chinuch. And I think I mentioned to you more than once that in Rav Soloveitchik's eyes, the Magen Avram was almost like a Rishon. Whereas in the Brisker, dynasty, there's like no relationship to Achronim. Like nobody rates. But I can tell you, I remember we learned once a Magen Avram in Hilchas Tainios. It was like a 2-line Magen Avram, very short. And the Rav was racking his brains for hours, literally hours, to try to figure out the Magen Avram, which he would never do for other Achronim. And this is a real bomb kasha on the Magen Avram. Where's the Zeichel Yitzis Mitzrayim in the Kiddush of Tefillah? All right. Now we move on to the Pri Megadim, another genius of geniuses. I mean, again, I can't even describe to you the genius of the Pri Megadim. My father, may rest in peace, knew every Pri Megadim by heart in Yordei Chelik Aleph at the age of 21. I mean, the Pri Megadim is gigantic. And he has what's called a Psicha Klolis, a general introduction and an overview to Chelik Orachayim. And we're seeing the tip of the iceberg here on pages Chav Zayin and Chav Ches. Yeshli lachkar chakira achas ugedolahi. He gives himself a grade here. This is a great chakira. Vahu, what is the chakira? Mitzvah sasation mechuyev adam lasosa v'nikra chova k'moshavim. Yitzur demin haTorah yotzeba. V'chazal omru shetzarich lasosa al tzad b'china sheyotze af min rabbanan. HaMashal b'zeh. Example. So from the example, we'll see what the conceptual inquiry is all about. Sukkah min haTorah yotze b'schach shegidlo min ha'aretz v'yeinu mekabel tumah. Okay, fine. Let's say you have gidulei karka that looks in the eyes of the spectator like it's not gidulei karka, like it's a kli. For example, pishtan, flax, is gidulei karka. It grows in the ground. And yet the Gemara says that in Rabbanon, there's something called anitze pishtan. It's like rolls and rolls of pishtan, which they roll up. And in Rabbanon, you can't use that for sukkah, for schach, or for example, chavalim. Let's say you make out of flax ropes, and it looks like a kli is makabel tuma, then the Rabbanon will passel the sukkah. He gives another example of gzeras nisarim, right? You have schach that is very wide instead of like narrow bamboo sticks or whatever you use for schach. That's called gzeras nisar. In all these cases and many more, the Rabbanan said that this is possible midrabbanan as schach. Mibaili means I have a suffix. Im yekayim al kol panim mitzvah say the sukkah min haTorah. If he violated the Gzera D'Rabbanan, but he used schach, which on a doraisa level is kosher, would he have fulfilled his mitzvah of sukkah? Kahai gavno lo gozu lakar mitzvah sukkah doraisa. We're now on page Chaf Ches. He says, we're not going to assume that because he used schach posel d'Rabbanan, therefore we're going to negate at least his kiyum of sukkah d'oraisa. The efsha de bruche loma vartinon. Maybe we'll say that since the institution of birchas hamitzvah is d'Rabbanan, he should not make a birchas hamitzvah on schach that's posel midrabbanan. But I'll call upon it. But at least grant me the premise that he could be yotze his mitzvah d'oraisa. You're going to steal from him and rob from him a mitzvah d'oraisa. On a Torah level, he has fulfilled his mitzvah of sukkah. The schach is kosher midoraisa. And in order to develop this question, he speaks about the mitzvah of kriyat. The Torah says, "Ubeshalbacha, uvekumecha." You may recall the Mishnah records in Machlokes Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. According to Beit Shammai, we don't pass like Beit Shammai. Beshalbacha means that at night when you recite Kriyat Shema Shel Arvis, it has to be in a reclining position, and bekumecha, Kriyat Shema in the morning has to be in a standing vertical position. We don't accept Beit Shammai. We accept Beit Hillel, and it's Zman Shchiva and Zman Kim. What would be if the man recited Kriyat Shema Kiddush Beit Shammai, and the Mishnah says he's not Yotze? Why? I mean, Beis Hillel allows you to recite Kriyat Shema in any position, whether you're standing, you're reclining. So he seems to have gone out of his way to do it the way Beit Shammai wants him to do it, and the Mishnah says he's not Yotze. So you see that the Rabbanan are not going to allow you to recite Kriyat Shema in the position that Beit Shammai requires you to do so, because we rejected Beit Shammai. And that's going to completely undermine and vitiate his kiyum d'oraisa. If we apply this prima godim to our case, where we recited Kiddush without yayin, then the prima godim, I believe, would argue that you're not Yotze Kiddush d'oraisa. If the Rabbanan required Kiddush ala yayin b'makom suda, and you went ahead and you recited Kiddush shalom b'makom suda without yayin, then you didn't even fulfill your mitzvah d'Rabbanan. I'm sorry, your mitzvah d'oraisa. Because once the Rabbanan established the mitzvah, the way they want you to implement the mitzvah, then the mitzvah d'oraisa now depends upon the d'Rabbanan. And then in the final paragraph of this very long presentation, he says it depends upon mazid versus onus. And he says the following: if a person knew very well that he was in violation of the D'Rabbanan, that's called mazid, then af min Torah lo yotze. We're going to rob him and negate even his kiyum d'oraisa. But ba'ones, yotze. The Rabbanan are not going to go as far as to say that we're going to negate the kiyum d'oraisa that you implemented when you were honest. For example, you were not aware of the fact that Nesarim are posel l'schach min Rabbanan mishum gzeres Nesarim. And at the very end of this presentation, he says, Misha hispalel tfilas yudches b'Shabbos. He davened a vacha dike shmonesrei on Shabbos, but vehizkir Shabbos, he mentioned that today is Shabbos. Yotza min Torah. Okay, that's the Magen Avraham. Mikol makom hol v'chazal asmechu akral kos yain v'kiddush makom suda im kein af min Torah lo yotza. So imagine a case of a person who, instead of reciting Kiddush in Shmon Esrei, he recited a weekday Shmon Esrei. And he thinks he's going to fulfill his mitzvah d'oraisa, which l'chora he should. But no. Lo yotza. Why? Because the Rabbanan said that the mitzvah of Kiddush should be al yayin and b'makom sud. Fascinating prima god. So next time they ask you the following question: when the Rabbanan require X, Y, or Z in order to fulfill a mitzvah, the Torah did not require neither X, nor Y, nor Z, and he went ahead and he fulfilled the mitzvah the way the Torah formulated it, disregarding X, Y, or Z, which was established by D'Rabbanan. Did he chash at least fulfill his mitzvah d'oraisa? What are you going to say to him? Ayin prima gadol. And then you'll show that you really know your beans, that the prima gadol is machadish, this radical chiddush of a D'Rabbanan that's oker d'oraisa, and l'chora, he's 100% right from the Gemara of Kriyat Shema with Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. So this leads us to page Chav Ches, which is called the Derech Pikudecha. Derech Pikudecha is one of the Polish great scholars known for his mystical thinking, his Chasidus. And if I'm not mistaken, he was the Dinover Rebbe. What's his famous work? Oh, it's at the tip of my tongue. It's a classic Hasidic sefer. Just give me a second, maybe it'll come in. All right now it just slipped my mind. But he also wrote a book called Derech Pikudecha. And in this sefer, Derech Pikudecha, he actually quotes the Pri Megadim, where he lived in the 20th century. And he says that in Kiddush, you're not Yotze B'Tfilah. Why? The Torah didn't give us a nusach of Tfilah, of Kiddush, correct? The Torah gave us Zachar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. It's a very ambiguous, general kind of mitzvah of L'Kadsho. We don't know exactly what nusach would fulfill L'Kadsho. And he argues that the Rabbanan were metakin a nusach of how to fulfill L'Kadsho. And once having done so, the Rabbanan have established that this is the way and the only way that you could be Mekayim the mitzvah of Kiddush d'oraisa. And this means that there's a certain authority to the Anshe Knesset Gdola to take an ambiguous mitzvah that's undefined and set up conditions how and when to fulfill that mitzvah. And once they do so, the mitzvah d'oraisa now becomes defined by the D'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan were authorized with their samchut, their authority, to define an ambiguous mitzvah. And when I read this, I thought of Chol HaMoed, because in Chol HaMoed the Torah says Mikra Kodesh. Well, what does that mean, Mikra Kodesh? I should get up and say today is Chol HaMoed, Haint is Sukkos, Haint is Pesach. What's Mikra Kodesh? And the Rabbanan said that Mikra Kodesh means Isur Malacha with 5 exceptions, Davar Avud and Tzarech HaMoed and so forth and so on. It seems to me that according to the Derech Pikudecha, when it comes to Chol HaMoed and Mikra Kodesh, the Rabbanan will tell you how to fulfill the mitzvah. And another example will be V'nisa Mesnafshel Seichem on Yom HaKippurim, as the Ran points out in the 8th parak, that the Rabbanan will define the 5 categories of Inui, and that's the way that you fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa V'nisa Mesnafshel Seichem. And if you fail to do so, you wash your body, or you anoint yourself, etc., then you have forfeited the mitzvah d'oraisa v'nisam, because there's a whole cluster of mitzvos which are given by the Torah in a very vague, ambiguous nusach, a formula which is very vague. And what the Torah is doing is they are pointing and appointing the Rabbanan with the authority of Asisa Kechal Asher Yerucha to define how to fulfill that mitzvah d'oraisa. And according to Derech Pikudecha, the mitzvah of Zachreu, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho fits that very unique category of a mitzvah which is vague in the Torah and handed over to the Chachamim to define how